Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is John Baptist. I was born in the rural area of Pine Valley, Pennsylvania in 1962. Today I'm 59 years old. Before me, I have my brother Gerald. On New Year's Eve of 1967, a tragedy occurred that changed the entire trajectory of our lives. My father was maliciously murdered by a bar owner. After the investigation, we learned that the bar owner had argued with my father because he was demanding payment of $5, and my father insisted he had paid days before. In this argument, my father was killed with 3 gunshots and several stab wounds. My mother was left widowed and 3 months pregnant. Some time passed when my brother was born in December of the same year. I had 3 experiences that I call supernatural. One particular night, I woke up and noticed that someone was opening the door, entering the house, going to my mother's room where my newborn brother was also located, then going to our room where my brother and I were. The next day, I didn't say anything to my mother. The second night, once again, I woke up at a certain hour of the night, and once more I heard the sound of someone opening the door with more speed and doing the same process as before, but with stronger and faster footsteps. Once again, I said nothing to my mother. On the third night, I woke up again. This time, I heard the sound of someone opening the door with great violence and stepping very heavily as if wearing boots. This time, he didn't enter my mother's room, coming directly to my room where my brother and I slept. I made a courageous decision. I uncovered myself and faced this person. When I looked at the person, I saw it was a man in a worn gray suit who, with both hands behind his back, was leaning over looking at me. I was terrified. The next day, I told my mother about all 3 incidents. She immediately said, "That's your father who misses you and comes to visit you at night. Pray for his soul and everything will pass." So I prayed the Our Father and Hail Mary for his soul, and I never had that strange visit again. Sometime later, I began to be awakened at night by a certain plaster doll that my mother had received from a friend. It was a doll in the shape of a Creole woman with a pot on her head where my mother used to store cotton. This doll would appear at night in real size and chase me. This happened several times. I would tell my mother, but she would ignore it and show no sign of believing me. One day I got so irritated that I took scissors and poked out her eyes. To my surprise, she appeared to me at night with her eyes poked out in real size, chasing me. The next day I took her to a large rock, took a hammer, and broke her with such anger until she turned to dust. She never appeared again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Maria, and I'm from Arizona, from the town of Red Rock. It all began one night. It was past midnight when I went out with my brothers, cousins, and 2 friends. We were going to a summer festival. When we arrived there, people said there wasn't going to be a festival anymore, that it had been canceled. But we didn't know that. Then we returned home, and the road we were taking was very deserted and very long. When we reached the road, I myself already felt something different, chills and cold shivers of fear. We began to walk, and when we were in the middle of the road in that desert, I heard something strange. It was the neighing of a horse, but it wasn't a normal neigh. It was a neigh that brought fear to your very soul. I said to everyone, "Guys, let's hurry up and find some protection around here, because in this desert we're in, only God can protect us." When I said that, the horse neighed very loudly on top of a hill and was coming down, already approaching where we were. One of my friends said he wasn't going to run, acting tough. But when he closed his mouth, he felt his face go cold because he saw the neighing and the hooves near him. We ran, but the more we ran, the more the road became deserted and distant, and the horse approached us at tremendous speed, neighing very loudly like an earthquake. The ground trembled and the trees swayed with great force. Moments later, we felt a very strong heat and began to pray, running and praying, until we found protection in the middle of the road. In front of us appeared a very large herd of cattle, lying down and standing up. We passed through the middle of the cattle. After we passed through the middle of the herd, we felt relieved because everything that was haunting us disappeared. To this day, we've never passed through that place again. My name is John Baptist. I was born in the rural area of Pine Valley, Pennsylvania. I'm 59 years old, married with 2 children. I've lived in San Francisco, California, since 1975. The accounts I'm going to tell happened at Willow Creek Ranch in the rural area. I grew up hearing various stories of supernatural cases that happened with my grandmother and my mother Maria, as we called her. The first account was told by her and confirmed by my mother. To this day, at 82 years old, she remembers and confirms what happened. My grandmother told us that since she bought that ranch in the 1940s, she encountered a very curious fact. Right in front of the house, about 900 feet away, there was a large rock mounted on top of another in such a way that it left a space where my brother and I, when we were older, would play house. She told us that under that rock, at 6 o'clock sharp in the evening, a bright blue light would turn on that would grow and diminish all night long and only go out at 6 in the morning. This light was seen by all her children, a total of 5, for many years. She would sit on the house porch at 6 o'clock to marvel at such a spectacle, and would take the opportunity to pray the Holy Rosary. She told us that many people who arrived from work in the late afternoon would ask why she was always there. During the day, she would tell them about it and show people who, upon seeing it, would continue down the road with respect and without saying anything. After some time, a man nicknamed Joe the Conjurer passed by there. According to what she told us, he was a practitioner of folk magic, a type of witch doctor. He asked, "Sarah, why almost every day I pass by here, you're in this same place?" She replied, "Joe, there's a spectacle under a rock that's on the other side of the creek that I like to see every night. Not just me, but my children too. Do you see that rock over there? Well, do you see that light? Well, since I bought this ranch, I've admired that blue light that grows and diminishes all night long, from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning." She told us she bitterly regretted showing the light to Joe the Conjurer. She said he spoke, "Well then, Sarah, I'm going there to see who this spirit is." My grandmother said that he headed toward the light. And when he stepped into the creek, the light went out and never turned on again. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 48 years old, and I was born and raised in the mountains of northern Montana. Since I was a kid, my life has been tied to the wilderness. The dense forests, the rocky ravines, the towering pines, and the hunt. My father taught me to read tracks when I was 8 years old, and by 15, I could hunt white-tailed deer even when they left barely a trace. I was never a sport hunter. I hunted out of necessity. In my younger days, the meat from what we brought down would last us weeks. It's not something you feel proud or ashamed of. It's just what it was. What I'm about to tell you happened 5 years ago. It's a true story. I've kept quiet about it for a long time because in my family, we don't talk about these things. And because even today, deep in the wilderness, there are things that shouldn't be spoken aloud. That time, I didn't go alone. I went with my cousin Matthew, who also grew up in these mountains. Both of us had plenty of experience. We knew how to respect the terrain and not get involved in things we didn't understand. But that time, we stumbled upon something that didn't come from the wilderness itself, but from people. It was October, early hunting season. Matthew had called to tell me that an acquaintance of his had spotted a group of deer near a dry creek between Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness, in a stretch of mountains that was difficult to reach. There were no marked trails, only old logging roads and cattle paths. You needed either a mule or good hiking boots, and we both had the latter. We left from the town of Whitefish with loaded backpacks, 30-06 rifles, supplies for 3 days, handheld GPS units, headlamps, first aid kits, and long-range radios. We didn't bring cell phones because there's no signal in that area, not even if you climb to the top of a ridge. The plan was to hike for 6 hours to a clearing Matthew knew, set up camp there, and head out at dawn to hunt. It was dense terrain, oak, pine, and slopes, where sunlight barely filtered through the canopy gaps. As we walked, we saw fresh deer tracks and mountain lion prints, nothing out of the ordinary. We arrived around 3 in the afternoon and set up camp at the edge of the clearing, next to a small creek that had already run dry. We strung a tarp between the trees, built a small fire for coffee, and checked our equipment. The silence of the place was perfect. There were no roads nearby, no voices, no dogs, just the sounds of the wilderness. Crickets, branches swaying, the occasional squirrel leaping between the trees. We had dinner jerky and canned beans, then sat drinking coffee with cinnamon, watching the sky fill with stars. The cold started to bite, and Matthew crawled into his sleeping bag. I stayed up a bit longer, jotting down some track marks I'd seen in my notebook, more out of habit than necessity. That's when I heard it, a distant gunshot, sharp with a short echo. It wasn't an echo or thunder, it was a rifle, but not one like ours. It sounded heavier, longer, maybe a larger caliber or a different type. I stayed still, holding my breath. I heard it again, this time closer, then another. I called Matthew in a low voice. He came out of his sleeping bag with his flashlight already in hand. "Did you hear that?" He nodded. "Those are gunshots, not hunting shots. Hunters don't fire 3 in a row." He was right. A hunter knows what he's looking for. 1 shot should be enough. 2 means something went wrong. 3 is a different story. We turned off the flashlight and stayed silent. The shots stopped, but the wilderness no longer sounded the same. It was as if the trees had closed in, as if the air didn't want to pass through. We heard branches breaking in the valley below, not footsteps, not voices, just controlled, deliberate steps, as if someone knew there were others nearby, as if they were avoiding us but watching us. We put on our jackets, grabbed our rifles, and quietly left the camp, skirting the clearing along the creek side. With each step, we stopped to listen. We didn't use flashlights, just the moonlight, which was dim, but enough to make out silhouettes. Matthew saw it first. He touched my shoulder and pointed toward the edge of the slope where the forest dropped into a small valley. There, among the trees, we saw a red light, faint like a lit cigarette or an LED. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Matthew whispered back, "but it's moving." We crouched down. The light was gliding between the trees, slowly. It wasn't going up or down, just circling, as if marking a line around our campsite. Matthew pulled out his radio and turned down the volume. He handed me a note written in his notebook. "Someone is prowling around. No noise, no flashlight." We returned to camp by a different route. We didn't want to leave our things alone. When we got back, everything looked the same, but the camp chairs were knocked over. Not by the wind, by something that had touched them. The footprints in the ground weren't ours. They were larger, with a marked heel, heavy boots. That's when we decided to take turns sleeping. One would rest for 2 hours, the other would keep watch. I took the first shift. At 3:30 in the morning, while I was sitting by the extinguished fire, I heard a voice, very low, almost a whisper. "Matthew." I stood up instantly, turning around, looking for the voice. It came from the north. It wasn't a shout or an alarm tone. It was as if someone was looking for him, but didn't want to alert anyone. Matthew was sleeping. I woke him with an elbow to the ribs. "What? They said your name." "Who?" "I don't know." We stayed motionless. The voice didn't return, but we knew we hadn't imagined it. Whoever was out there knew our names. We grabbed our backpacks, packed everything necessary, and before dawn, we were already walking back in silence, without flashlights. We didn't say a word the entire way until we saw the first dirt road. There, for the first time, Matthew spoke. That wasn't a hunter. That wasn't mountain folk. Whoever was out there didn't want us to see them, but they did want us to know they could see us. After that, neither Matthew nor I returned to that area. We didn't report anything to the authorities. What were we going to say? That we saw a light and heard a voice. But since then, other things started to make sense. A friend who works with the Forest Service told us weeks later that in that part of the mountains, they found hidden camps. People who don't live in towns or communities, who don't appear on lists or records. Some say they're opium poppy growers. Others say they're old veterans who never left the mountains, people living in the cracks of the country, with their own rules, their own language, and their own way of warning that they don't want company. Sometimes, when I hear distant gunshots from my house in Whitefish, because you can still hear them, especially during dry season, I remember that voice among the trees saying my cousin's name calmly. And I think that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't the animals, the falls, or getting lost. It's being seen by someone who doesn't want to be seen, but does want to be remembered. After that trip, Matthew and I kept seeing each other as always. We'd meet for lunch at the farmer's market in Whitefish, talk about work, family, the kids. But we never touched on the subject of the mountains again. It wasn't that we'd agreed not to, it simply wasn't necessary. That experience was understood between us as something to be kept, not because it's scary to tell, but because you run the risk of not being believed. For weeks, every time I was alone in the shop in the afternoons, I felt like someone was watching me from the street, even when no one was there. It wasn't paranoia, it was an old intuition. When you hunt, you develop a sense that doesn't fade with age. You learn to feel when there are eyes on you, even when they're far away, even when you can't see them. Once at 6:30 in the evening, a customer I'd never seen came by, tall, dark-skinned, wearing a thick jacket despite the warm day. He asked me to adjust the scope on a bolt-action rifle. He brought the weapon in a black case with all the papers in order, everything legal. "What do you use it for?" I asked, more for conversation than interest. He looked at me for a second. "To watch over what shouldn't be seen." I didn't respond. I told him to come back the next day. That night, I didn't sleep well. A few months passed. By March, things had calmed down. I convinced myself that maybe we'd exaggerated, that perhaps someone had gone into the woods for something strange, but that it no longer had anything to do with us. That Matthew and I had simply had the luck, or misfortune, of being there on the wrong day. But the wilderness has memory, and sometimes whoever enters doesn't decide how they leave. One day, while my wife and I were having lunch, I saw Matthew calling my cell phone. It was strange. He almost never did that. I answered. His voice was tense, drier than normal. "Can you come to my house? Everything okay?" "Yeah, but I need you to see something." I went. He lived south of town, near the bypass. When I arrived, he had me go straight to the room where he kept his hunting gear. There, on the table, he had a cardboard box. Inside was a clear plastic bag with something in it. "They left it in my mailbox," he said without a message. Without a name, just that. I took it out of the bag. It was old, but not too old, covered with dirt and mold at the corners. When I opened it, I realized it was handwritten field notes, terrain drawings, coordinate markings. It wasn't a child's or school notebook, it was a field diary. The first pages talked about routes, rest points, observations. They mentioned slopes, dry creeks, canyon entrances. But the strange part came later. Halfway through the notebook, the notes changed in tone. They weren't written like a hunting log, they were warnings. Two men passed by, one tall, the other limping on his right foot. They camped near the clearing. They didn't turn on a flashlight. The second night, the one in the blue jacket writes in a notebook. My blood ran cold. I was wearing a blue jacket on that trip, and yes, I wrote in my notebook while Matthew slept. Who the hell had been so close? Since when? How many times? Nobody from town wrote this, I said. Nobody who uses that kind of language. Look how it's written. I know, Matthew replied. That's why I haven't shown it to anyone else, not my wife, not the police. We stayed silent, that kind of silence that hurts in your throat. Then Matthew told me something that left me colder than everything before. Look at the last page. I opened it. There was only one sentence written in black ink in capital letters. Those who see must not speak. Nothing more. We closed the notebook, put it back in the bag, and buried it in his backyard in a sealed toolbox. Not because it was illegal, not because we wanted to hide evidence. We did it out of respect, out of instinct. Today, 5 years have passed. I still go to the mountains, but only to areas I know well. I hunt on private ranches or in open places, never on closed slopes or deep canyons. Matthew stopped going. He sells fishing equipment now. Every once in a while, I still get messages from other hunters, people who say they saw something strange in a certain part of the mountains. Lights that shouldn't be there. Shots that no one reports. Roads where boot prints appear but no cars nearby. I listen to them. I never tell them I understand, but I do give them advice. If one day you feel like someone is watching you, even if you can't prove it, don't try to look for them. Don't turn on the flashlight. Don't raise your voice. Walk as if you don't notice, and the next day leave. Because up there, in places where the map has no lines, it's not the government that rules, nor the cartels, nor the communities. There's another law, older, quieter. And in that law, the mistake isn't trespassing. The mistake is looking where you shouldn't and living to tell about it. My name is David Rodriguez. I'm 34 years old, and I was born in Phoenix, Arizona. I'd never been hunting before. It wasn't a tradition in my family. Although in Arizona it's not uncommon, plenty of people here hunt from childhood, knowing how to distinguish deer tracks, wild boar trails, or bobcat signs. But in my house, we were always more about working in the shop, staying in town. The invitation came in November of 2022. I'd been months without steady work, helping out my cousin's business selling used auto parts, and I was getting fed up with the routine. It was a friend, Carlos, who proposed we go. He told me his uncle organized night hunts through the mountains between Prescott and Flagstaff, where the high desert starts to merge with forest, and the roads turn into rough trails. You just need to go and learn. You don't have to kill anything if you don't want to, he said. I accepted out of curiosity more than anything. I wanted to break out of routine, do something different, feel that adrenaline everyone talked about at dinners and gatherings. Carlos introduced me to the group. His uncle Armando, a man around 50, weathered by the sun with a serious demeanor. Snake, a skinny taxi driver with restless eyes. And Jesus, a guy younger than me, someone's relative who spoke little and carried a shotgun that looked older than he was. We left on a Friday night from Phoenix in 2 pickup trucks. I rode with Jesus, who drove in silence while the others rode in the other truck, talking among themselves. The road got complicated after passing through Quartz Lakes. The trail we took had no signal and was barely passable. We arrived at a clearing near the base of Granite Mountain. There we left the vehicles and got ready. The moon was high but partially covered by clouds. The cold seeped through the gaps in my jacket, and the air smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and hidden animals. We split into 2 groups. Armando and Jesus would go north, following a trail where they said they'd seen recent wild boar tracks. Carlos, Snake, and I would go the opposite way, crossing a dry wash and climbing a small promontory covered with brush. We separated around 10:30 p.m. with short-range radios, headlamps, and .22 caliber rifles, except me, who only carried a flashlight and a knife. I felt useless, but they told me it was fine, that I was there to learn. We advanced in silence with calculated steps. Carlos went ahead, illuminating the ground occasionally, looking for signs. Snake smoked without saying anything, as if that was normal in the middle of a hunt. An hour later, we heard something in the brush, the sound of broken branches. We crouched down. I turned off my flashlight. My heart was pounding. Snake raised his rifle but didn't shoot. Whatever was moving went away without making more noise. It wasn't big, or so we thought. We crossed the wash and reached an area where the terrain opened up a bit. Carlos suggested we take a break. We sat among the rocks, drinking water and checking the radios. That's when we heard the first message. Armando to base, someone copy. It came through with interference. This is Carlos, copy. Everything okay over there? A long pause. Negative, Jesus is hurt. We're coming back. We looked at each other. How hurt? Carlos asked, pressing the button. What happened? Silence. Then one more phrase, not an animal, not an animal. The radio went dead with a beep. We stood up immediately. Snake threw away his cigarette and raised his rifle. Nobody said anything, but we were all thinking the same thing. That phrase wasn't normal. It took us almost 40 minutes to get back to the clearing where we'd left the trucks. We didn't see anyone. The place was as we'd left it, but with a different tension, as if someone had touched it in our absence. A few minutes later, we saw the lights of a flashlight in the distance. Armando appeared alone, walking steadily with the shotgun hanging from his shoulder. His face had an empty expression, like a man who no longer hears what's happening around him. His shirt had bloodstains, many, but no trace of Jesus. Carlos ran toward him. Where's Jesus? He went back, Armando replied without looking at anyone. What happened to him? He tripped, cut himself. Nothing serious, he said in a voice without emotion. Snake approached, noticing the same thing I did. The blood wasn't on the sleeves or torso, but on the hands, as if he'd put them into something. Not splattered, but covered. And more than anything, it smelled like animal blood, a different smell, strong, acidic. Without saying anything, I moved away and tried calling for my cell phone. No signal, just a red cross symbol. We loaded things back into the trucks in silence. Nobody asked anything more. Armando got in the other truck alone. We went back with Carlos driving. We were heading back when Snake muttered, "This isn't right." Nobody responded. The next day I woke up with a headache. The air still smelled like the field. I checked my phone, no missed calls, but a message was waiting for me. It was from an unknown number. Don't ask about Jesus. He wasn't on the list. I didn't understand. I looked through the chats. Carlos had created a WhatsApp group a few days before to organize the trip. There were 5 members: Carlos, his uncle Armando, Snake, me, and Jesus. I went into Jesus's profile. No photo, no posts. I went into the individual chat. The history had disappeared, as if it had been deleted by him or someone else. I sent him a message. All good, it wasn't delivered. I tried to talk to Carlos that afternoon. I went to his house. His mother opened the door and told me he wasn't there, that he'd left early that morning. That night, the same anonymous number wrote me again. "This isn't your hunt. Don't follow it." And along with the message, a photo. It was the clearing where we left the trucks, taken from a high point, like from a tree branch or nearby hill. In the image, you could see all of us, me, Snake, Carlos, and Armando with his shotgun. But there was something else. A dark bulk among the pines, half hidden, almost imperceptible, a standing figure watching us. That was what we didn't notice, what had been there from the beginning, what Armando knew. Days later, Carlos looked for me. He was strange, nervous. He asked me not to talk to anyone about what we saw, that it was better to leave it like that. He said his uncle didn't want problems, that Jesus was a stranger with no family nearby. What does it mean that he wasn't on the list? I asked. He stayed quiet. Who decides who is and who isn't? He looked at me. In his eyes was fear. We're not the only ones who hunt, he said. Sometimes we're the bait, and he left. I never saw him again. Today, every time I pass by some road between the mountains, I think about that. About how a simple hunt can be something else. About how you can enter a game without understanding the rules, without knowing who organizes it, and worst of all, without knowing who they're really hunting. After that conversation with Carlos, I never slept peacefully again. There was something in his voice, in that way of avoiding looking at me directly, that confirmed what I'd suspected from the pit of my stomach since that night. What happened in those mountains wasn't a simple hunting trip. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the first time. The following days I tried to focus on daily life. I helped in the business, made deliveries, stayed home longer. But I couldn't stop thinking about Jesus. Nobody mentioned him. Nobody looked for him. I searched Facebook, Instagram, even hunting forums, looking for someone with his name, his face, something that would tell me he existed before that night. Nothing. Then I started thinking about a possibility that was hard for me to accept. What if Jesus wasn't who he said he was? What if he was included in the hunt for a different reason? One Saturday morning, I passed by the street where Snake lived. His taxi was outside. I gathered courage and knocked on the door. He took a while but came out. He looked haggard, deep dark circles, trembling hands. He had that kind of face you see on someone who has seen more than they should. I asked him directly, "What happened to Jesus?" He looked down, didn't speak. "Did you know something was going to happen?" He invited me in. The living room was dark with only one lamp on. It smelled of cigarettes and dampness. He served me black coffee and sat across from me without touching his. "We didn't know Jesus," he said. "He was supposed to be someone's cousin from the group, but nobody recognized him. Armando brought him, just introduced him that day." That seemed strange to me from the start. But since many people get into hunting for the first time that way, we let it pass. And why would they lie about that? I don't know if he lied or if Armando knew but didn't say. What I do know is that night, before we separated, Armando asked me not to use the GPS, that this trip was different, that I shouldn't record anything, shouldn't ask too much. I stayed silent. I understood that in these mountains, people take care of themselves, there are codes. But this was already something else. Snake continued, "I think we didn't go to hunt anything. I think the target was him, Jesus, and that it wasn't the first time they'd done it." He told me that some time ago, on another night trip, someone else also got lost, a young man from Tucson who was going for the first time. They never found his body. Those who went that time said he'd slipped on a slope, but that story never added up. "I never got too involved," Snake said. "I just went for the pleasure of being in the mountains. But now I understand there are people who use those mountains for things that aren't spoken about." He got up, went to his room, and came back with an old plastic folder. He gave it to me without saying anything. Inside were a couple of old printed photos. One was of the same clearing where we'd left the trucks. In the image, you could see a different group, at least 6 people, a woman and a figure in the background, barely perceptible among the trees, dark, tall, with no distinguishable face. The other photo was of a trail, not an animal trail. It was a long stain on the ground, as if someone had been dragged. The file was dated May 7th, 2021. "A guy who's no longer around took that photo," Snake said, without clarifying whether he was dead or disappeared. "And since then, nobody goes up to that area alone." I asked him why nobody had reported it. Why nobody talked? Because there's nobody to report to and nothing to say. You're going to go to the police and tell them someone disappears in the mountains and there's blood that's not from animals. They're going to laugh, or worse, they're going to tell you they already know. A week later, I received a WhatsApp message from an unknown number. It just said, "Don't get involved anymore," and a location. It corresponded to the dirt road where we'd left the vehicles that night. It was as if they were inviting me to return or warning me that they knew I hadn't left it behind. That same day, I went to Carlos's house. His mother told me he'd gone to work with an uncle in Tucson, but his Facebook account was still active, posting stories as if he were in Phoenix. I called him, no answer. I sent him a message. All this was planned. He never read it. In the end, I did what everyone does when the truth doesn't fit logic. I tried to continue with my life. But you can't live the same after something like that, can you? When you know that in the mountains where people go to look for wild boar, some go up knowing not everyone will come back. Not when the new guy in the group turns out to have no past, no family, no profile, no clear origin. And not when there are men like Armando, serious, silent, who know how to use the night, who know roads where GPS doesn't work, and who never tell you why they really take you. Months later, I ran into an old acquaintance from the area. We talked about the weather, unimportant things. I mentioned almost in passing that I'd once gone hunting with Carlos's uncle, with Armando. He looked at me intently, took time to speak. "You were with Armando in the Granite Mountain area." "Yes." "Don't go with him anymore. He doesn't hunt, he delivers." He wouldn't say more. He patted my shoulder and left. And that was the worst part, because that word delivers left me with more questions than answers. Delivers what? To whom? For what? Today, I avoid the mountains. I avoid hunters and avoid invitations that seem harmless, because I've understood that not everything that happens in the forest is natural. Sometimes the roads aren't there for you to follow them. They're there for you to get lost. And in Arizona, when someone disappears in the mountains, people say it was an accident. But I don't believe that anymore. I know some don't get lost. Some are chosen. My name is Jake Martinez. I was born in Tucson, and I'm 42 years old. What I'm going to tell you happened 3 years ago, but only now do I feel clear-headed enough to talk about it. Don't expect ghosts or things that crawl in the darkness. What we experienced was real, raw, and somehow still doesn't have a complete explanation. Not because it's supernatural, but because there are things that simply don't want you to know. It all started like anything in Arizona, between friends, beer, barbecue, and a midweek conversation. There were 5 of us in the group. Nacho, my buddy since high school, Fat Valenzuela, who we met in college, Ariola, who was the one who got hunting permits and always had stories about mountain roads, and Skinny Tony, who was new to the group but good people. One of those quiet but sharp guys. I was the one who always drove. A black Silverado I bought used, but well equipped for rough terrain. The idea was simple. A long weekend in the mountains in the area between the Catalina Mountains and the Santa Rita Range, heading toward Mount Graham. We were going to hunt deer and camp for a couple of nights. We had rifles with permits, GPS, radios, a full cooler, and a large tent. We were prepared. That part wasn't improvised. We left on a Friday at 5 a.m., and before noon we were already setting up camp near a dry wash that Ariola knew. It was an area with shade, dense forest, ideal for walking in the morning and hunting at sunset. We made a fire, prepared coffee, set up tents, everything as usual. The first night nothing strange happened, just the normal sounds of the wilderness. Distant coyotes, creaking branches, the wind. Around 2 in the morning, Nacho and I heard a sharp gunshot, like a shotgun, very deep in the distance. But we took it as someone else hunting in the area. We didn't give it importance. The second day, we started seeing strange things. In the morning, we went out in 2 groups to walk the trails. I went with Nacho and Fat, while Skinny and Ariola took a trail north. Around 10 a.m., walking among oaks and junipers, we noticed something that didn't belong. In the middle of the forest, right next to a large tree, there was a metal tube stuck in the ground. It wasn't an old post or ranch remains, it was recent. We approached. It had a kind of dark lens at the tip. It was a camera, like the ones biologists use to monitor wildlife. But this one wasn't pointing at an animal trail. It was oriented right toward the path we'd been coming from. We stared at each other, all 3 of us. Fat said it might be from the Forest Service or some hunting ranch. We took photos but didn't touch it. That night we returned to camp and told the others. Ariola said he'd also seen something strange, a small satellite dish tied to a tree, also pointing at the trail. There's a cabin half hidden about 1 kilometer from here. Old but in good condition. It doesn't look inhabited. We passed by it at noon and there's no trace of people. Nothing. No firewood, no trash, just clean, too clean. A silence fell. We all started getting the same feeling. Someone was watching the area, but not for security or flora conservation. It was something different. The next day, we decided to all go together to check out that cabin. We got up early and left everything secured at camp. We walked for almost 40 minutes north, following the GPS that Ariola had marked. When we saw it, we understood what he'd said. It wasn't an old cabin like the ones from before, but a clear wood structure with boarded windows and a rust-free metal roof. It had no fence or gate. At first glance, it looked abandoned, but it didn't look deteriorated. As we approached, we noticed the walls had new nails. There was no trash or fire remains. Fat thought to circle it, and he was the one who found it. Behind, among the brush, was a black box like a toolbox. When we opened it, we saw the impossible. Inside were cables, a car battery, a small antenna, and a portable monitor. It was on, reproducing in real time what a camera was capturing. The same one we'd seen in the forest the day before. "Are they recording us?" asked Skinny. "Since before we arrived," said Nacho. Nobody laughed. We inspected more. On one side of the cabin, under a loose metal sheet, there was a metal box with portable hard drives. In one of them were folders labeled with dates. When we opened one, we saw video fragments, people like us, hunters, explorers, walking on the same trail. Some alone, others in groups. All recorded from a distance without knowing it. That's when the alarm went off seriously. This wasn't animal surveillance. It wasn't authority monitoring. It was something more organized, something that documented people entering that area. The debate was intense. Skinny wanted to take the hard drives. Fat wanted to leave immediately. I was just thinking about one thing. If there's a camera, a monitor turned on, and all this so clean, then someone comes regularly. And they hadn't taken anything because they planned to return. We decided to take photos, save coordinates in the GPS, and move. No taking evidence. The consensus was, we get out of here, load everything in the truck, and get the hell out. But the way back felt different. It was no longer the adventure from before. The forest seemed more closed, the wind drier. Halfway back, we found something else. Fresh tire tracks from a large truck, right in the dry wash bed. Someone had passed through there after us. We arrived at camp, everything intact, but the feeling was clear. We weren't alone. We packed in silence. We didn't eat. We left toward Tucson before noon. On the road, there was no talk. Only when we reached the toll booth did Ariola say it. That wasn't a hunting post or surveillance. It was something else. That night, everyone went to their homes. The next day, Skinny called me. He said someone had called him from an unknown number. He didn't answer. Then Fat told me his Facebook was blocked for suspicious activity. And 3 days later, I got an email with no subject. It only had an attached image, a screenshot of the 5 of us walking on the trail, seen from above. No message, no text, just the image. Since then, we haven't returned to those mountains. We hunt, yes, but closer, shorter, without GPS, without active cell phones. Some will say we exaggerated, that it was just a ranch with sophisticated surveillance. Maybe. But what I know, what I can't get out of my head, is that they were recording us before we knew that cabin existed. That there's a record of our faces, our names, and our steps through that place. And most likely, there are still more cabins like that at other points in the mountains, waiting for someone else to pass without knowing they're being seen. So if you ever go hunting in the Arizona mountains and find a structure that's too clean, with cameras pointing at the trail, don't approach. Don't ask questions. And above all, don't look directly at the lenses. Because if they recorded you, they've already seen you. And if they've already seen you, most likely you'll never stop being watched. For weeks after that trip, we stayed in contact more out of obligation than friendship. Each of us was locked in our own paranoia, as if we only talked to make sure the others were still alive. Skinny stopped responding in the WhatsApp group. Ariola, who had always been the most adventurous, canceled 2 mountain trips he already had planned with other acquaintances. And me? Well, sometimes I'd disconnect my house modem at night, not for security, but for a stupid sense of control, as if that could cut any gaze from outside. But the worst was what happened to Nacho. One Tuesday night he called me, agitated. The first thing he said was, "Bro, they broke into my parents' house. They didn't take anything." I thought he was talking about a robbery, but he interrupted me. "Nothing, Jake. Not the TV, not the money. They just went through my dad's room and took the laptop. Nothing else." His father had died 6 months earlier. That laptop had been stored away for years and was turned on. "Were they using it?" I asked. "No, it was in a box with books. Nobody had touched it since he got sick." Nacho filed a report. The cops just said the typical thing, some vagrant looking for valuable stuff. But he knew it wasn't that, and so did I. The coincidences were already too many. I reviewed my social media, my old emails, even messenger conversations I had with Elias, that contact from the urban exploration group I'd met months before. I started cross-referencing names, addresses, and strange email patterns, any clue. I found nothing. I deleted old accounts, closed profiles, changed passwords. And then I started doing something I never thought I'd do. I asked around. I went to see a guy who works in computer forensics, one of those who help companies recover burned hard drives or delete sensitive data. We'd met on a state job I had years ago. I paid him to review the metadata of the photos we took in the mountains. He was the one who told me, "Your camera didn't have GPS, but some of these photos have tags that someone added later, as if external software had modified them." Modified how? He showed me a file called route marks, txt, inside my phone's automatic backup. I'd never seen it. Inside was a list of coordinates with dates and times. This isn't generated by your phone, Jake. This is an external record, as if something was using your phone to mark places you passed through. Did you have any weird apps? Just the hunting ones, maps, weather. Did you install anything new that weekend? I didn't remember, but when I looked at the Play Store history, I found an app called Trail Lock. I didn't recognize it. It had no icon or description, but I'd installed it that weekend. I didn't install it. He asked me to restart the phone and do a complete format. I did it. I threw away the phone the next day and bought a new one, basic, one of those that only works for calls and messages. That day I knew for certain we were involved in something bigger. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a system. Someone was mapping people, routes, behaviors. We hunters were just one segment. I went back to look for Areola. I saw him thin, nervous, distrustful. He refused to talk about the subject. "It's over, don't dig into it. You want answers, but that's what they want for you to get closer." They, who? He didn't answer. A week later, Fat left for Colorado with his family. He turned off his phone, deleted social media, didn't give notice. I found out through his brother. He said something strange had happened in the mountains, and he was never going hunting again. Skinny reappeared. He called me from an unknown number. He just said, "Don't open anything weird. If you see something connected to your network, disconnect everything." You didn't see anything. Nobody saw anything. And he hung up. After that, there was calm, a nervous, tense calm, as if everything was on pause. I focused on work, stopped going to the mountains, deleted my exploration accounts, distanced myself from the hunting group. I tried to live normally. But something became clear to me. That cabin wasn't unique. That structure with well-placed cameras, discrete technology, and surveillance mechanisms is part of something bigger. It's not just about the roads, it's about the people, their transit, their behavior. I don't know if it's military. I don't know if it's some security company or something worse. An informal, parallel, unofficial network that uses the mountains as a laboratory to experiment, to map, to collect. I'm not making this up. All of that is documented. I saw it with my own eyes. And that's what worries me most, that it wasn't secret. It was silent, yes, but it was there within reach, as if they didn't care if we discovered it. As if they also wanted to see how far we'd go. And you know what? We didn't go very far. They broke us with little an image in an email, a stolen laptop, an app we never installed. And that was enough to scare us. Today I don't hunt. I don't join groups. I don't explore. I moved. And yes, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with that feeling that someone is reviewing my movements. Sometimes I hear noises on the street that I didn't notice before. People parked in cars without plates. Phones that ring and hang up after the second tone. But I don't ask questions anymore. I don't get close, because I understood that there are things that aren't hidden so they won't be seen. They're hidden so you think you discovered them. And when you fall into that trap, you're already in their game. My name is Arthur Stevens. I'm 42 years old, and although my ID says I'm a merchant, what I've been doing for the last 15 years has been something else. I'm not a hitman, thief, or drug dealer. I hunt. I hunt what I shouldn't and sell it where I can. Poacher, they call it, though I prefer to say I know how to move around. I know half the mountains of Oregon like the back of my hand, from Mount Hood to the Cascades, passing through roads that aren't even on maps. I've slept in caves, eaten what the wilderness provides, and brought down game worth more than others make in 3 months. But never, and believe me when I tell you this, had I ever been as scared as I was that time on a ranch between Sisters and Bend. And if I dare tell it today, it's because I want you to think twice before getting into lands you don't know. Because there are people up there who don't just protect their property with weapons, they protect it with rules, with systems, with brutality. And worst of all, without leaving a trace. A buddy named Fabian, who's from around there, told me about it. He told me he'd seen large deer crossing through a private area where there used to be a breeding operation. He said the owners had gone north and the land was now only used to store machinery. According to him, nobody patrolled it. And the security, what security? It's halfway up the mountain. The most you'll find are cowboys passing through. He showed me a couple of photos from trail cameras he'd left 2 large deer, one with a full rack. My eyes lit up. I had a pending order in Portland. They offered good money for fresh meat and some hide. I went. The ranch was about 20 minutes by ATV from a closed trail that branched off from a dirt road near an old quarry. There were no signs saying private property or electric fences, just old wires twisted by humidity and brush. I entered at sunset, armed with my old bolt-action rifle loaded with 3 bullets. I carried my backpack with supplies, knives, and a tarp to sleep. I planned to enter, look for tracks, and if I saw something, take it down. I'd sleep there and at dawn leave with the game. It was routine. I went in slowly among the oaks. The forest was humid, foggy, and sometimes I could barely see beyond 15 feet. I left the ATV hidden among some bushes and walked in a straight line on a trail that opened between the trees. After a few minutes, I saw the first strange thing. A metal tube stuck in the ground like a hollow post with no clear function. It wasn't for light or fencing, it was just there. And 20 meters later, another one. Later, I learned they were sensors. I saw the first deer around 6 o'clock. It was at the edge of a clearing, grazing. I positioned myself among some rocks, took a deep breath, aimed. But before pulling the trigger, I heard something, a humming, as if someone had turned on a generator very far away. It lasted about 3 seconds. It broke my concentration. The deer raised its head, sniffed the air, and left. I decided to wait for it. It got dark quickly. I didn't turn on any light. I put the tarp between some high rocks and covered myself with a thermal blanket. In the mountains, you get used to the cold. I ate some tortillas with sardines and stayed listening to the forest sounds. Around 9 at night, I heard the first scream. But it wasn't human, or so I thought. It was like a coyote's howl but distorted, as if it came from a distant speaker, artificial. Seconds later, another one closer, then silence. I sat up, grabbed the rifle, started feeling something was wrong, that I wasn't alone, that they'd seen me. And then, at 9:01 exactly, the worst thing happened. I heard a barely perceptible click, and suddenly the ground under my feet disappeared. I fell into a trap, a rectangular pit more than 6 feet deep. It had no stakes or blades, just a dry fall. I twisted my ankle, screamed in pain. I tried to climb, but the walls were smooth. In the dark, without signal, without rope, I felt like a caged animal. I was trapped. I thought maybe it was an old trap, but within a few minutes, in one corner of the pit, a red light the size of a coin turned on, like a sensor. And I heard a recorded voice with a neutral tone. Trespasser detected. Sector 3D Red Protocol. Estimated response time, 7 minutes. I almost pissed myself. I stayed motionless with the rifle pointing up, waiting to see a face, a flashlight, something. But nobody came. Not after 7 minutes. Not after 20. Not after an hour. The whole night passed me with a swollen ankle, shivering. Every so often, the voice repeated the same message with mathematical precision. I couldn't sleep. I didn't want to. At dawn, I heard footsteps. First one, then several. Silent, coordinated, as if they weren't stepping on branches. A face appeared. It had no balaclava or cap, just a neoprene mask with a visor. It observed me in silence. Another appeared. He had a metal rod with a curved tip. They pointed a camera at me. Name, I didn't answer. You have 30 seconds to talk, said one. The voice was deep with a northern accent. Arthur, my name is Arthur. I'm not from here. We know. They threw me a rope. Tie it around your chest. Don't try to run. Don't talk. Don't look back. They took me through the forest, blindfolded. We walked for almost an hour in absolute silence. I heard metallic sounds, coordinated footsteps, distant humming that I didn't know if were drones or generators. When they removed the blindfold, I was inside a wooden cabin. There were screens showing cameras, several men in tactical suits without insignia, a map of the terrain with sectors marked in red. One of them approached. He didn't give his name. We're not going to kill you. You're not the first, but you are going to understand. They showed me a screen. It was my photo taken from a high angle the night before, aiming at the deer. Another of me eating. Another while I slept. We tracked you from when you crossed the trail. You didn't see the sensors, but they captured you. I swallowed hard. Who are you? That doesn't matter. This land isn't yours or your friends. It's part of a network. Hunters don't enter here. Curious people don't enter. Not even military without notice. And what do? We protect. I didn't understand. One showed me a list, names, dates, places where hunters, assailants, curious people had disappeared. We're going to mark you and release you. I didn't know what he meant until they pulled out a red-hot branding iron. I tried to scream. They held me down. They branded my shoulder with a symbol I'd never seen, a circle with 3 diagonal lines. I lost my breath. I passed out. I woke up at the outskirts of the ranch. My ATV was intact with gas. On the seat a note, "Don't come back, don't talk, don't come back." It took me 2 days to return with fever, the brand infected. I didn't go to the hospital. A lady from a nearby town who knows herbs and doesn't ask questions healed me. Since that day, I haven't returned to the mountains. I sold the rifle. I bought a stall at the farmer's market and started selling country things, oregano, honey, dried chili peppers. What the land gives me without having to go deep into the forest. And every time someone asks me why I stopped hunting, I tell them the same thing. There are places that don't want to be found. And although they swear the cabin doesn't exist, although the maps say there's nothing there, I know what I saw. And I know others have seen it too. Some don't return. Others, like me, do, but they're never the same again. Because there are presences that don't scare, don't scream, don't attack. They just watch, they wait, they stay. And when you realize it, they've already gone with you. After what happened to me, I tried to continue with my life, and for weeks it seemed to work. I went back to selling at the market normal things, used clothes, tools, chargers. With that, I made enough to live. I stopped going to the mountains, yes, but I didn't stop thinking about them. About what I saw, about what I didn't see. The brand on my shoulder took time to heal. I was left with a scar that still burns when it's cold. I never knew if it had any meaning, but every time I see it in the mirror, I remember the feeling of burned skin and the humming of those sensors in the forest. 2 months passed, and then they looked for me. It was a Thursday at the Redmond Farmers Market. I was already packing up my stall when a man approached normal clothes, jeans, plaid shirt, hat. Tall, thin, but with a firm gaze. He didn't look like a customer. "You're Arthur Stevens." I denied it by reflex. He pulled out a folded sheet. It was a print on matte paper, my photo walking with the rifle on my back in the mountains. Another with the rope tied around my chest, being pulled from the pit. "I'm not here to hurt you, but we need to talk." We went to a taco stand near the market. He didn't tell me his name, but as soon as he opened the conversation, I knew he was related to those people. "Do you know what that ranch was where you trespassed?" I supposed it was a breeding operation or something. It was part of a monitored private property network, but not like you understand it. They're containment zones. Containment of what? Of presence. I didn't understand, and I think he knew I wasn't going to understand completely. "How many times did you enter the mountains without permission? How many times did you hunt something illegal?" "Many times." "And they never caught you until that night. Why do you think that was?" I didn't know what to answer. "It wasn't coincidence, Arthur. You were already marked before entering." He gave me a small black notebook, old. Inside was a handwritten list, more than 100 names. Next to some, dates. Next to others, the word neutralized. Next to my name, it said observation in progress. "What is this?" I asked. "A warning." What he explained wasn't official. It wasn't government laws. It was something parallel, a private surveillance system without permits, without trials, without rights. It operated in certain high areas of the mountain's properties, registered as abandoned, ejigal lands that were sold, without going through any public papers. Old ranches adapted with technology you can't get at any store. Each zone had a letter A, B, C, up to J, and within each one, numbered sectors 1A, 2C, 3D like mine. Every time someone entered undetected for a period longer than 20 minutes, a protocol was activated. They called it the Red Protocol. That protocol didn't always end like mine. Most don't come out. Do you want to know why they let you live? Because you didn't understand. And those who don't understand don't represent a threat. I asked him if he was part of some government agency. He laughed. The government doesn't get involved in this. It can't and doesn't want to. We protect what shouldn't be known. And what do you protect? Zones where there are things that can't be moved, where things have been done that can't be known. He didn't tell me with mystery. He told me like someone repeating a rule that doesn't need explanation, as if he'd answered that same question 1,000 times. And then he asked me a question that left me dry. "Did you tell anyone about this?" "No, sure. Yes. He looked at me for several seconds, then nodded. Good. Then we're going to make a deal. I never saw the man again. I never knew his name or origin. But since that conversation, every time I passed near the area where everything happened, I got messages from unknown numbers. Once I stopped to have a Coke at a roadside store heading toward Sisters. 10 minutes later, I got this. Too close, Arthur. Remember the deal. Another time in Bend, I got a call from a number that, when answered, only emitted a long beep, like a medical machine tone. That was the deal. Stay away, don't go back, don't talk, don't look. I kept it until recently. 3 weeks ago, one of the buddies I knew from my poaching years, Ephraim from Pendleton, called me desperate. He told me his younger brother had disappeared in the mountains, that he'd gone with 2 others to camp near a river called Eagle Creek Canyon. When he told me the location, I felt my stomach turn. Sector 13, next to mine. I didn't think much about it. I went for him more than anything. I owed him an old favor. We arrived at the place at night. There was no signal. We left the truck far away and continued on foot. Not even 20 minutes passed when we saw it, a metal post stuck with faded paint. The same design. We stopped, and in the background, on a rock, was his brother's cell phone. Turned off, covered with dew. Ephraim shouted his name several times, and then again we heard the humming. The same humming from that night, slow, constant, like a hidden motor underground. I told him we had to leave. And the worst part was that before leaving, on a large stone illuminated by the moon, we saw something carved with a knife. The mountains don't forget. They only decide when. I haven't returned since then, and I don't plan to. I live in a quiet town far from the mountains. I work in a motorcycle shop, and when someone talks to me about going camping, hunting, exploring virgin areas, I make up an excuse not to go. I'm not left with fear of the mountains, I'm left with respect. Because I know that up there, not everything that seems free is wild territory. There are zones marked with invisible ink. Zones where there are no police or laws. Zones where you enter only once. And if you're lucky, you come out with a scar that will burn your whole life. My name is Julian Martinez. I'm 37 years old, and I was born in Denver. But I've been living for 5 years in a small town at the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in southern Colorado. The reason I moved here is Carolina, my wife. We met at a New Year's party in Colorado Springs. She was visiting with some cousins, and I was wandering around heartbroken. A year later, we were already living together. Her family is country folk, serious people, people of their word and quiet. Her father, Don Lupe, is one of those men who doesn't tell you if he likes you or not. But if you need something, he's the first to stand up without asking questions. He has thick hands full of knots like they're roots from an old oak. Sometimes it seems like he can't stand me, but other times he invites me to things I wouldn't expect. Like 6 months ago, when he told me if I wanted to come with him to hunt a wild boar that was tearing up the fences on his property in the upper part of the mountains. I accepted more to look good than out of desire. We went in his Ford F-150 from '97, with the windows down and a sack with tortillas and jerky. We left at dawn when the sky was still dark blue, and the fog seeped between the pines like copal smoke. I carried a backpack with water, a thick jacket, and a flashlight. He carried his old shotgun, an Italian one that looked like a museum piece, but that people in town said never failed. The mountains are another world. The temperature drops suddenly, and the sounds change. There are no longer engines, dogs, or neighbors' music. Just the trees moving slowly as if they were breathing. And once in a while, a distant cry from some bird you don't know if it's a hawk or a soul in torment. The plan was to camp near a water source called Deer Pass. Don Lupe said that's where animals showed up because the water was clean and fresh. To get there, we had to walk about 3 hours from where we left the truck, on a narrow trail full of fallen leaves and roots. As we climbed, he told me things about his youth, nothing spectacular. That once he ran into a bear, that another time lightning struck 20 meters from him. I just nodded. We didn't talk much. The hike was long and heavy. The altitude and cold suck your breath away, even if you're young. At Deer Pass, we set up a shelter with tarp and ropes between 2 trunks. We set traps further ahead where there were signs that the boar had been rooting around. The marks were recent. The disturbed earth and remains of a bitten fence told us the animal wasn't far. We slept in shifts, first him, then me. But it wasn't deep sleep. You can't sleep completely in the mountains, not with that dense silence. On the second day, things changed. We woke up to the sound of branches breaking near camp. Don Lupe stood up suddenly without saying a word and took the shotgun. I followed him with the flashlight on. They weren't hurried steps, but they were heavy. Something big. The sound came from the east side where there's a small canyon. We walked stealthily, careful not to make noise. The sun was barely rising, and the fog was still thick. The first thing we saw was a blood stain on a rock. Then another further ahead, splattered as if something had dripped it from above. The air had a strange smell, like copper or guts. We kept advancing until we found it. It wasn't a wild boar. It was a deer, but it was opened from the neck to the lower part of the belly. Not like you'd open one with a knife to remove organs. This looked done by pulling, torn as if something with brutal force had ripped it apart. The ribs showed, broken. Don Lupe stood looking at the scene without moving, as if he were doing calculations. I felt my stomach tighten. The deer had its tongue hanging out, eyes open, and there wasn't a single vulture nearby. This wasn't a wild boar, he said almost in a whisper. I asked him if it could have been a bear. He said bears don't do that. They kill, yes, but they eat. Here it seemed like they killed it just to kill it. Besides, the deer had no bite marks. It was just opened, and something stranger, there were no tracks nearby. Nothing. No drag marks, no claw marks. We returned to camp with that image in our heads. We didn't say much on the way. Don Lupe didn't want to break camp yet. He said we should wait, but that we shouldn't sleep. He was restless, as if he recognized something but didn't want to say it. When night fell, we lit a small fire, very low, more to get warm than for any other reason. We left the flashlight charged. Every so often, Don Lupe would stand up to look toward the trees. The sounds of the mountains changed. Everything fell silent, no crickets, no branches, no wind. At midnight, we heard a howl. Not like an animal's, more like a hoarse, pained cry. I asked Don Lupe what it was. He didn't answer, just raised the shotgun. We walked a few meters outside camp and saw blood again. This time on the trunk of a pine, as if something had crashed against it. And then we saw it, a large shadow moving among the trees. It wasn't running, it was walking, but its shape was strange. It didn't fit with anything I knew. It didn't have the shape of a wild boar, bear, or deer. It was taller, like a man, but with something hanging from the sides, something like loose skin. I can't say I saw a face. I just noticed it stopped, that it knew we were looking at it. Don Lupe fired. The echo of the shot rumbled through the valley. The thing, if you can call it that, didn't scream, didn't flee. It simply disappeared among the trees. We went to the place where he shot. There was no blood, no body, just broken branches and a strong smell like burned hair. Don Lupe grabbed my arm and said, "We're leaving now, leave everything." We walked without talking as fast as we could. We didn't collect anything, no backpacks, no food, no tarp. We reached the truck with our hearts in our throats. He didn't turn on the radio or talk the whole way. He just smoked. I felt like I was coming out of a wake. When we got home, Carolina noticed something was wrong. Don Lupe just said, it wasn't the wild boar, it was something else. And he locked himself in his room. He never wanted to talk about the subject again, and he never went back up to Deer Pass. I have told it, but almost nobody believes me. They say it was the cold or fatigue, that maybe it was a sick bear. But no, I know what I saw, and Don Lupe knows it too. Since then, every time I go up to the mountains, I go with more respect. Because there are things up there that don't look for food, they just kill. And not all of them leave tracks. Days passed, and I couldn't stop thinking about what we saw that night, or about the way Don Lupe acted. I'd never seen him like that, nervous, insecure, scared. Him, who doesn't flinch even with lightning, who has buried brothers and godfathers and hasn't shed a tear. At first, I thought the fear would go away with time, that you return to your routine, and that's it. But no. I'd wake up at dawn thinking something was outside the house. I even got to the point of checking with a flashlight in hand like a fool, walking around the fence. Carolina noticed. "Did you dream about that again?" She asked me one night while we were drinking coffee in the kitchen, almost at 3 in the morning. I didn't answer. I just lowered my head. It was she who gave me the clue without meaning to. She told me that her father, when he was young, worked a few years as a forest ranger in an area called La Maroma, a bit further north, almost reaching New Mexico. There he saw strange things, she told me, but he never wanted to tell them. He just said, "The mountains also take care of their own." That phrase kept spinning in my head. 3 weeks passed. One Saturday, I went alone to downtown Alamosa to do some shopping. I took the opportunity to stop by the shop where Leandro worked, a mechanic who knew Don Lupe well. He'd helped me repair the water pump once and knew things about the mountains. We were there among iron and grease when I asked him the question, without beating around the bush. "Have you heard of anything strange at Deer Pass?" Leandro stayed quiet. He left the wrench he had in his hand on a tire and looked at me with a serious face. "You went there," I nodded. "With Don Lupe." I nodded again. He didn't say anything more for a few seconds. Then he went into the shop office and came out with a beer in his hand. He offered it to me, opened another for himself, and sat in a metal chair. "Look, compadre, things have been happening up there since before I was born. My grandfather said that area was territory of the loners. That's what they called animals that didn't hunt in groups, that didn't leave tracks. They weren't witchcraft or devil stuff, they were real. You just didn't know what they were." He told me that in the early 80s, 2 hunters from Pueblo disappeared. They left the truck well parked at the trail access and didn't return. On the 3rd day, they found them, or what was left. some clean bones with no signs of common attack, as if they'd been boiled. Everything inside a ditch covered with branches. The agents who went up said it had been a landslide, that animals ate them. But nobody believed that, not even the Red Cross people who helped bring them down. Lindro lowered his voice. I got to see, about 8 years ago, a corral opened with 20 sheep with their throats cut. Not a bark from the dogs, not a returning footprint. The owner sold the plot and left. Nobody rented that piece of mountain again. I looked at him with skepticism, but deep down, part of me knew something didn't add up. Everything sounded too organized for a simple predator. That same week, I made a decision. I had to go back, not out of bravery or craziness, but because I couldn't stand the idea of staying with the doubt. I went back up, but not to Deer Pass directly. I used another trail from the east side. I brought a borrowed drone from a friend from Denver who studies environmental engineering. Nothing professional, but with a good camera and almost an hour of battery. I went up alone early. By noon, I was already in a clearing from where you could see part of the pass. There, I set up a small base with a shade net and a folding chair. I wanted to record the area from a distance. I installed myself with the drone, camera on, and started watching. The first few days, nothing happened. I saw deer, foxes, even a couple of coyotes. I recorded their routes, took notes. But the fourth day was different. It was around 5 in the afternoon. The sun was already going down. The drone was flying over Pine Canyon, where we'd seen the open deer, when suddenly something moved fast among the trees. The camera only caught a flash, a silhouette. Not human, not a common animal. Too vertical, but with something hanging from the sides, as if it wore loose skin or had layers of exposed muscle. I recorded it. I have it. There's no face, no defined paws, just a bulk that moves as if it floats among thick branches without breaking them. The drone lost signal seconds later. When I recovered it, one of the propellers was broken. I found it thrown among bushes about 100 meters from where I'd lost sight of it. I went down that same night. I drove straight to Don Lupe's house. I showed him the video. He watched it without saying anything, only once. Then he served himself a mezcal and told me, I told you it wasn't a wild boar. I tried to ask him what he thought it was. He looked at me with that weathered face, hardened by years of weather. I don't know, but it's not from now. That's been walking since my grandfather was a child. That's why nobody lives up there. The mountains aren't alone, they have an owner. That was the last time we talked about the subject. But since then, I've started to hear other stories. Cowboys who hear screams at dawn, plots where animals appear dead without blood, dry like they've been squeezed, tracks that appear alone in wet earth and don't lead anywhere. I'm not crazy. I have the video. I have the testimonies. And I have a warning for whoever wants to listen. Not all creatures that kill do it for hunger. Some do it by instinct, and others for territory. Now I know why Don Lupe doesn't go up to Deer Pass anymore. And I don't plan to go back either. My name is Albert, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago. I still can't sleep properly when I think about it. Back then, I was struggling to make ends meet. My day job at the hardware store barely covered rent, so I started a side business restoring antique furniture. I'd buy beaten-up pieces from estate sales, fix them up in my garage during evenings and weekends, then flip them for a decent profit. It was honest work, and I was getting pretty good at it. My younger sister Emma had just been diagnosed with a medical condition that required expensive treatment. Insurance would only cover part of it, and our family was already stretched thin. Every extra dollar mattered, so when a potential customer contacted me about a vintage mahogany dresser I'd posted online, I was immediately interested. The only catch was her location. She lived way out in the countryside, about an hour's drive from town, in one of those old farming communities that time seemed to have forgotten. But she was offering cash up front and paying well above my asking price, so I couldn't refuse. I arranged with my buddy Jake, who ran a small moving company, to deliver the dresser on a Saturday afternoon. The delivery went smoothly enough. The customer, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, lived in a sprawling farmhouse surrounded by overgrown fields. She seemed pleased with the piece, paid in crisp bills, and even offered us sweet tea. The problem started when we were ready to leave. Jake suddenly remembered he had another pickup scheduled across town, and his truck could only fit one of us for the return trip. He felt terrible about it, but time was money in his business. Rather than spend the cash I just earned on a taxi for such a long distance, I made what I now know was the worst decision of my life. I decided to walk home. It was only about 7 miles, and I figured I could take the old county road that cut straight through the abandoned Morrison farm. It would save me at least 2 miles, compared to sticking to the main highway. My mistake was not calculating how long it would take. By the time I reached the dirt road that served as a shortcut through the Morrison property, the sun had already set completely, and I was walking in near total darkness. That road was eerie even in daylight. It cut through what used to be a massive corn farm back in the 1940s, but had been abandoned for decades. Now it was nothing but overgrown fields, twisted oak trees, and the skeletal remains of an old barn that had partially collapsed years ago. The air felt different there, heavier somehow, with this musty smell of damp earth even though it hadn't rained in weeks. I was walking at a brisk pace, using the light from a cheap yellow flashlight I'd bought at a gas station. The weak beam barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead, casting dancing shadows that made every bush and fence post look threatening. I tried to focus on the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel, but it was impossible to ignore the oppressive silence around me, broken only by the constant chirping of crickets. It was somewhere in the middle of nowhere that I first felt I wasn't alone anymore. You know how your mind tries to rationalize things when you're scared? I told myself it was just nerves, just my imagination playing tricks on me because I was anxious about walking alone in the dark. Maybe it was an animal in the underbrush, or the wind rustling through the dead corn stalks. I kept telling myself to stop being paranoid and pick up the pace, that I'd soon reach the lights of town. That's when I heard it. It started very quietly, almost like a humming sound. I stopped walking for a moment, trying to figure out if the sound was coming from outside or if it was just in my head. But it became clearer. It was a melody, a music box melody. You know those tinny, slightly off-key notes that play slowly, like a lullaby. It was completely out of place in the middle of abandoned farmland. At first, I wasn't scared, just confused. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere with something like that? I thought it might be a trap, someone trying to get my attention to rob me. I pointed my flashlight toward where the sound seemed to be coming from, sweeping the light across the tall grass at the edge of the road. The music stopped abruptly. It was in that exact moment of silence that my flashlight beam found her. Along the side of the road, marking the boundary of the old farmland, there was a barbed wire fence that was falling apart. The wooden posts were rotted and leaning at odd angles. On top of one of those posts, which couldn't have been more than 4 inches wide, sat a figure. I say sat, but that's not exactly right. She was balanced there like a bird perched on a branch, perfectly still. It was the silhouette of a woman, or maybe a teenage girl, with her back to me. She wore a simple dress and remained completely motionless. It was impossible for anyone to balance like that. Physically impossible. I stood frozen in the middle of the road, my flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand, but I couldn't look away. My brain searched for any explanation, but there was none. There was just this figure positioned in a way that shouldn't exist. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that silhouette. It could have been seconds or minutes. In that moment, there was only the light of my flashlight and that strange figure in the darkness. Then she moved. Slowly, unnaturally, her head began to turn in my direction. Her body remained facing away from me, toward the field, but her neck kept turning, until her face was completely facing me. The flashlight illuminated her features, and what I saw, I swear I'll never forget as long as I live. It was the face of a girl, maybe 17 or 18 years old. Her skin was too white, an overwhelming paleness like candle wax. But it was her eyes that made my entire body freeze with terror. She had no eyes. In their place were just 2 perfectly round, black holes, empty and void. A smile spread across that pale face, a wide smile that didn't reach those dark hollows, and then she jumped. It wasn't a normal jump. She launched herself from the post in my direction, but instead of falling, she floated a couple of feet off the ground. She came straight at me at an impossible speed and whooshed past me. As she passed, I heard laughter. It was a low, muffled cackle that seemed to come from deep in her throat, but her mouth, that smile, didn't move. The whole thing happened in an instant. My body spun around by pure instinct, trying to follow her with the light, but there was nothing behind me. The road was empty and dark. The relief lasted exactly a split second. That's how long it took to feel cold air on the back of my neck and smell dust, stale air, and something like mold. She was behind me. I turned around with my whole body stiff and found myself face to face with her. We were inches apart. I could see the details now: skin that looked like old paper, thin lips stretched in that unmoving smile, and those black holes that seemed to absorb what little light there was in the air. The laughter continued, the same muffled sound, but her face remained motionless like a mask. My gaze dropped in pure panic. Her simple, dark dress ended in nothing. She had no legs, no feet. She was floating in front of me. She slowly raised her right hand. Her fingers were long and pale, and she touched my shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive touch. It was light, almost curious, as if she was confirming that I was real. But the cold of that touch was ice from another world, penetrating through my shirt, through my skin, and settling directly into my bone. She stared at me for one more second with those voids, and then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she launched herself backward, sinking into the darkness of the field and disappearing among the trees. Her laughter faded with her until the only sound was once again the crickets. I stood there alone, unable to move a single muscle. My shoulder burned with the cold of her touch. That cold on my shoulder was what snapped me out of the trance, what brought my body back to life. It was like an electric shock that filled me with panic. My brain could only form one simple command: run. And I ran. I ran like I'd never run in my life, not even as a kid. I didn't dare look back. I just threw myself down that dirt road, stumbling in potholes, my flashlight swinging wildly in my hand, casting crazy shadows that seemed to stretch and move strangely around me. That's when the noise started in the underbrush to my right. It wasn't a normal sound, not a startled animal fleeing from me. It was something heavy, something big, breaking dry branches and crushing vegetation with a force that made the ground vibrate slightly. And the most terrifying part, whatever it was kept pace with me. I was running like crazy down the road, and the sound of this thing moving through the dense brush stayed exactly parallel to me. It was too fast, too agile for the weight it seemed to have. Curiosity is a stupid thing in the middle of desperation. I couldn't help myself. I turned my head for a fraction of a second and pointed my flashlight toward the darkness of the field. I saw it for just an instant, but I saw it. It was no longer the woman. It was a thing. A dark, shapeless mass, low and robust, maybe the size of a large dog, but it didn't look like any animal I knew. It looked like a cluster of rotting leaves, branches, and wet earth, all pulsing and moving as if it were a single organism. This thing passed through a small clearing between two trees, and its movement wasn't that of an animal. It was a kind of sliding, dragging motion, fast, and in a way that doesn't exist in nature. The panic gave me more strength to run. I ran even faster, feeling the air burn my lungs. Then it started throwing things at me. First a handful of dirt and leaves that hit my back, then a small stone that whizzed past my head. It was playing with me, hunting me for fun. Above the sound of my own desperate breathing and breaking branches, I heard the laughter again. The same low, muffled cackle without joy. It was coming from inside the field, coming from that thing. I couldn't feel my legs anymore, just moved them by pure survival instinct. My chest felt like it was going to explode at any moment. But then, far ahead, I saw a light, a weak, yellowish light from a street lamp. It was the beginning of the asphalt, the beginning of town. It was my only chance. Seeing that small light gave me hope. I gathered the last drop of energy I had and ran for my life. The noise in the underbrush continued for a few more yards, always at my side, with that laughter pushing me forward. When my feet finally touched the cracked asphalt of the first town street, the noise stopped. I dared to look back, gasping, leaning on my knees. The dirt road was dark and silent. There was no sign of anything or anyone. The laughter had disappeared. It seemed like none of it had really happened. But the cold on my shoulder was still there, a frozen spot on my skin. I don't even know how I got home. I opened the door and my mom, who was in the living room, got scared. She said I was pale, that I had no color, with bulging eyes and shaking from head to toe. I tried to speak, to tell her what had happened, but no sounds came out. My throat was closed. In the following days, things only got worse. I completely lost my voice for almost a week, and when it came back wrong. I developed a stutter that I still have today. When I get nervous or try to talk about that night, I stumble over words. The stutter hits me hard. A neighbor of ours, an older woman who's a folk healer, came to the house at my mom's request. She performed some cleansing rituals, passed a bundle of rue over my body, and said I had caught a very strong fright from some evil thing that crossed my path. Gradually, the raw fear diminished, but it never really disappeared. But the part that really keeps me from sleeping well to this day happened the morning after the encounter. I woke up late, exhausted. I went to the kitchen and through the window saw something on the doorstep. My heart jumped in my chest. I gathered courage and went to see what it was. It was one of the drawer pulls from the dresser I had delivered. A shell-shaped metal pull that I had polished and screwed in place myself. It was there on the entrance mat, scratched and twisted as if it had been violently torn off. For that to be there meant that thing hadn't just followed me. It had gone to Mrs. Henderson's house, ripped off the drawer pull, and then brought it to my door. That thing didn't just attack me in the middle of nowhere. It knew who I was, knew where I lived, and left a message. A reminder that the terror hadn't stayed on that road. It had followed me home. I never again walked alone at night. And sometimes when the silence is complete, I think I can still hear, very faintly, the sound of an off-key music box playing in the distance. What I'm about to tell you happened several years ago, but to this day I feel a strange unease whenever I remember it. There were 5 of us, myself, Marcus, Gabriel, who was the oldest, Samuel, and Bridget, plus Gabriel's dog. We had this tradition of taking at least 2 camping trips a year, heading out to some isolated spot far from any city. Gabriel owned a beat-up Chevy pickup that could handle rough terrain, so he usually ended up being our unofficial guide. The dog was his too, a Belgian shepherd named Billy, a very gentle animal who had camped with us many times before and was the joy of our group. On this particular trip, we went to a wilderness camping area in a remote corner of the North Georgia mountains that a friend of Gabriel's had recommended. It was truly isolated. We had to drive for almost an hour on a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. When we finally got out of the truck, the air was heavy with that strong smell of decomposing leaves and damp earth. The place was a small clearing surrounded by very dense forest with ferns that reached our waists. You could feel the humidity clinging to your skin. It was while we were unloading our backpacks and tents that I noticed the first strange thing. It was Billy. Normally, he would bound out to explore, running around like crazy to mark his territory, but this time he didn't. He wouldn't leave Gabriel's side. He stayed close with his tail low, almost between his legs, letting out short, muffled barks directed at the forest. He wasn't barking at any specific point, but at the tree line in general, as if the entire woods were a threat. "What's wrong, buddy?" Gabriel said, giving him a pat on the head. "You smell a coyote or something." We laughed and commented that maybe the dog was just nervous about the new place. You know how it is. We always find a logical explanation for everything. We finished setting up camp, and Billy's uneasiness ended up taking a back seat. It was just a strange detail we decided to ignore, at least for now. Night fell suddenly, the way it always does when you're far from the city. There's no slow twilight, the sky just goes dark and that's it. We lit a campfire. Gabriel opened the thermos of coffee, and Samuel, as always, grabbed his guitar to strum some songs we all knew how to sing badly. The mood was good, relaxed. The only one who didn't relax was Billy. He lay near the fire, but with his ears alert, attentive to every crack of a branch coming from the darkness surrounding us. After a few hours of talking, I noticed the flames were getting weak. I said I'd go look for more firewood. During the afternoon, I had collected a pile of dry, thick branches and made a neat stack near a large oak tree about 10, maybe 15 steps from our campsite. I remembered the spot perfectly. There was enough wood to last all night with some to spare. Only when I got to the spot, there was nothing there. The ground was clean, really clean, as if I had never stacked a single twig there. I returned to the circle of friends, running my hand through my hair, confused. The first thing I thought, of course, was that it was a prank. "All right, very funny. You can give it back now," I said, looking mainly at Samuel, who was the biggest joker in the group. He stopped playing guitar and looked at me with a face that said he didn't understand anything. "Give back what, dude?" "The firewood, the pile of firewood I left over there," I insisted, pointing toward the tree. "It disappeared." Gabriel got up seriously and went over there with me, lighting the way with his flashlight. He swept the ground with the beam of light. Nothing. Not even the ground looked disturbed. It was as if my memory of that woodpile was an invention. "Marcus, didn't you leave it somewhere else?" he asked in that calm tone that sometimes irritated me. "I'm sure it was here, Gabriel. I'm not crazy." It was Bridget who cut off the discussion, her voice a little lower. "Guys, the fire's going to go out." That settled it. We couldn't stay in total darkness. There was no choice. We'd have to go into the woods to gather more branches. I felt like a complete idiot, but it was also my responsibility to fix it. Samuel, Bridget, and I volunteered to go, grabbing our flashlights. Gabriel clipped the leash to Billy's collar. The dog whimpered softly. "Wait, I'm coming with you guys," Gabriel said. And so the four of us, with the dog visibly upset, left the safety of the campfire and entered the dense darkness of the forest. We hadn't walked even 5 minutes into the woods when the atmosphere changed completely. The weak light from our campfire disappeared behind us, and the darkness seemed to become thicker, as if it had weight. The air got colder, and the sound of crickets and cicadas that we'd been hearing from camp simply died. The only noise was our own feet crushing dry leaves on the ground. At least, that's what I thought at first. Gabriel went ahead with the most powerful flashlight, sweeping the beam from side to side. Billy walked with his body low, pressed against Gabriel's leg, so tense he looked like a spring about to snap. I came right behind with Bridget and Samuel bringing up the rear. That's when we heard it. A loud crack, unmistakable, a thick branch breaking somewhere to our right. We all stopped at the same instant, frozen. Gabriel turned the flashlight sharply toward the sound, but the circle of light only revealed more trees, more vines, more darkness. "Must be an armadillo or something," Samuel whispered, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. Nobody answered. We kept walking, but now the silence was different. It was a heavy silence, loaded with an attention that none of us wanted to have, and the noises continued. They weren't as clear now, they were more subtle. A rustling of leaves that didn't match the rhythm of our steps. A soft snap far to the left, almost beyond hearing range. It was the horrible feeling that someone else was walking with us, staying in an eerie way always at the edge of darkness where our light couldn't reach. That's when Billy started to growl. It wasn't an alert bark. It was a low growl that came from deep in his chest, vibrating in the animal's body. The hair on his back was all standing up, and Gabriel had to hold the leash with both hands because the dog was pulling, wanting to advance toward the blackness. We were already gathering some fallen branches, each of us with a clumsy bundle in our arms, when Bridget grabbed my elbow with a force that scared me. Her hand was ice cold. "Marcus," she whispered, and her voice barely came out. "There's someone standing over there." My whole body bristled, but I tried to stay calm. "Where, Bridget?" "There," she pointed with her chin. "Behind that bigger tree, just watching us." Samuel, who was closer, pointed his hand flashlight toward where she indicated. The strong, white light bathed the tree trunk, the ferns around it, the dark earth. There was absolutely no one there. "There's nothing there, Bridget." "You're just nervous," Samuel said, but his voice also faltered a bit at the end. We continued for a few more yards. The atmosphere was terrible now. Nobody was talking. We just wanted to grab the minimum amount of firewood so we wouldn't spend the night in darkness and get out of there. It was when Samuel himself suddenly stopped, making me crash into his back. "Holy shit," he gasped. "I saw it. I swear I saw it. There was a silhouette there between those two trunks." Gabriel, now out of patience, turned the main flashlight toward the indicated spot. And again, the powerful light found only the empty, indifferent woods. I was the only one who hadn't seen anything. To my eyes, it was just the normal darkness of a forest at night. But my two friends were terrified, and the dog was acting like we were face to face with a predator. I tried to hold onto logic, to fatigue, to the power of suggestion from fear. But a cold doubt was already starting to appear in my head. Something was very wrong. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was an idiotic attempt to act brave, or maybe I just wanted to end this situation as quickly as possible. I was scared, sure, but I think my stubbornness was stronger. I gathered all the firewood I could carry in my arms and spoke with a firmness I didn't feel. "Enough, we have enough. Let's go back." I made an effort to go to the front, as if I wanted to prove a point. Complete stupidity, I know. Gabriel and Billy came right behind me, then Bridget and Samuel practically walking glued to each other. We walked maybe 20 yards. Billy's low growling had transformed into a thin, agonized whining. It was at that moment that I saw it. It wasn't like the others had described. It wasn't a person hiding. It was movement, a completely wrong movement. Out of the corner of my eye, I stopped walking immediately. Between two large trees about 30 yards from us, a shadow formed. It was tall, taller than an ordinary man, and it was thin. Too thin in a way that didn't seem natural. It didn't hide from us. It just stayed there, a silhouette perfectly outlined against the deeper darkness. A stain even darker than the darkness itself. Then it moved again, and that movement broke my logic, broke something inside me. It didn't walk, didn't run. It slid. The figure moved from that tree to another one about 5 yards away in a fraction of a second, without making a single sound. It was a smooth, impossible movement, like black smoke sliding down an invisible wall. It repeated the gesture, getting closer. It slid from one trunk to another, an elongated silhouette that seemed to stretch and contract each time it stopped. I felt as if a pair of eyes were fixed on me, even though I couldn't see a face, features, nothing. The firewood I was carrying fell from my arms, making a dry noise that broke the silence. Gabriel, realizing I had frozen, asked with a trembling voice, "Marcus, did you see it?" I could only nod. I couldn't speak. It seemed like the air had disappeared. Next to me, I heard Bridget let out a muffled sound, a sob of terror. She tried to scream, but what came out was a high, weak screech. We were all like that, trapped. We wanted to run, scream, do anything, but our bodies simply wouldn't obey. The figure stopped behind one last tree, dangerously close to us. We could only see its outline, watching us from the darkness. The seconds seemed to never pass. Then a voice tore through the silence. It was Gabriel. "Run, now." His command was what broke our paralysis. Survival instinct finally kicked our brains into gear. Nobody thought, nobody looked back. We just ran. We ran desperately, tripping over roots, over thin branches, scratching our faces and arms. The only sound in the world was our gasping breath, the noise of our feet crushing the forest floor, and Billy's frantic, terrified barking as he ran for his life alongside us. We came out of the woods like a pack of frightened animals, stumbling toward the clearing, gasping, dirty with earth. We ran to the campfire, which by then was just a small pile of red, pulsing embers. For several seconds, no one could speak. We stood there hunched over, hands on our knees, trying to suck air into our burning lungs, trying to understand if all of that had been real. It was Gabriel who raised his head first. He pointed the flashlight to one side of our campsite, and we all looked in the same direction. The firewood was there, but it wasn't just there. It was stacked, perfectly stacked in a way that none of us would do. The branches were lined up by thickness, from thickest to thinnest, forming a perfect rectangle. It was a much more organized pile than mine, almost decorative. That wasn't relief, it was mockery. It was a message, a terrible message. The creature hadn't lured us into the woods for just any reason. It was playing with us. Nobody said a word. What could we say? The proof that we weren't crazy was right there in the form of that impossible woodpile. The panic from running gave way to a frozen confusion that was almost worse. Billy, who had calmed down for an instant, started growling again. That same low, vibrating growl directed toward the darkness we had just fled from. Gabriel knelt beside him, his hand in the dog's fur. "Easy, boy, easy. Everything's okay now." And it was at that moment that it happened. It was fast, too fast for the brain to process. We heard a single sound coming from the darkness. It wasn't a fight, it wasn't an attack growl. It was a yelp. A short, sharp, and terribly muffled yelp, as if a giant hand had covered the dog's muzzle mid-bark. And that sound was followed by a wet snap, a moist sound of something breaking with violence. And then absolute silence. "Billy," Gabriel called, his voice going up an octave, already breaking with panic. He pointed the flashlight toward where the dog had been, 1 or 2 yards from him. There was nothing. The ground was empty. We ran over there. Lying on the dry leaves, we found Billy's leather collar. Torn, it didn't look cut but burst, as if it had been ripped off with absurd force. And next to it, a dark, thick puddle was beginning to form on the forest floor. A trail of blood led away from there and dragged toward the tree line, disappearing into the darkness after a few yards. Nobody screamed. Nobody cried. I think the shock was too great to allow any normal reaction. Gabriel knelt in the dirt, looking at the broken collar in his hand, repeating the dog's name in a whisper that could barely be heard. We didn't discuss it. In robotic silence, we dismantled the tents, threw everything any which way into the truck bed, and got out of there in the middle of the night, leaving behind the dying campfire, and that perfectly arranged pile of firewood as bizarre proof of what had happened. Our friendship, which had seemed so strong, simply fell apart after that night. Gabriel never blamed me out loud, but I could see it in his look. The guilt was mine. I was the one who worried about the firewood. I was the one who started that walk toward death. To this day, when I close my eyes in the silence of my room, I can still hear it. It's not my fear, it's not my friend's screams that I hear. It's that short, muffled yelp and the wet, final sound of something breaking in the darkness. Good evening. My name is Sergio. What I'm going to tell you happened quite a few years ago, but to this day, when the silence of the highway gets heavy, the memory returns with all its force. I'm a trucker, a life I inherited from my father. Back then, I was going through a complicated phase. I had just spent a fortune on a complete engine overhaul for my truck, an old Peterbilt that was my livelihood. The shop bill drained my savings and left me in debt on top of it. I was accepting any freight that came up without thinking twice about it. It was in that situation that Vincent called me. Vincent was a freight broker, a middleman. Everyone in the business knew his reputation. He got the strangest jobs, the ones that paid too well to be completely legitimate. I had already turned down a couple of his jobs before. But as they say, necessity has a voice that screams louder than common sense. I was in my mother-in-law's kitchen, having a cup of fresh coffee, when the phone rang. "What's up, Sergio? Can you talk?" His voice sounded a little raspy on the call. "Depends on the job, Vincent," I answered drily. "Relax, man, it's something good. A job came up for you quick, 1 day only, good pay in cash, half up front." He made that pause I already knew, the pause of someone about to drop the problem. "It's a private transport, kind of confidential." That word confidential already gave me chills. In our language, that could mean anything from smuggled goods to something much worse. "Confidential how? What kind of cargo?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Vincent let out a little laugh. "It's just taking some wooden crates from one ranch to another here in the region. The owner is an older guy, doesn't like strangers or people asking too many questions. That's why I thought of you. You're trustworthy, you do your thing and leave." The offer of cash money up front was exactly what I needed to pay off the debt with the shop. I fought against my own intuition, that voice screaming at me to hang up and forget about the whole thing. But the image of the mechanic's receipt in my wallet won. Vincent gave me the address, and the next morning I was there. I took a dirt road of that reddish earth that the sun cracks and rain turns into soap. After almost half an hour of getting shaken around, I saw the barbed wire gate he had mentioned. The place was simpler than I had imagined. A large plot of land with the forest already eating at the edges, a small house, and a shed with a metal roof that gleamed under the hot sun. As soon as I stopped the truck, 2 men came out from inside the shed. They were figures that time had punished, thin, quiet, with sunburned skin. One of them, the older one, was chewing on a toothpick in the corner of his mouth. They didn't even say good morning. "You the freight guy Vincent arranged?" asked the younger one with a drawling voice, without much enthusiasm. I just nodded, confirming. The older one then approached and extended his hand, not for a handshake as I thought at first. "The keys," he said, short and dry. "We'll back the truck in to load it." That raised a fury in me that I could barely hide. I don't know if you or those listening understand, but a truck is sacred to a trucker. It's our home, our tool. Nobody puts their hands on another man's truck. It's an unwritten rule of the road. "No need, boss," I'll back it in myself. I'm used to tight maneuvers." The man didn't move an inch. He just kept staring at me with sunken eyes that seemed to have no end. The silence that followed was heavy, and I understood the message. I was the intruder there, and the rules were theirs. I felt my pride break, but I swallowed hard and handed him the keys. I stayed outside in the packed dirt yard, feeling useless. From there, I watched how they loaded the 3 crates. And what crates they were. Enormous, made of dark, almost black wood that looked ancient. They were absurdly heavy. It took both of them plus a third guy who came out of the darkness of the shed to lift each one. They had no handles or anything to help. The men lifted them with pure brute force, with that low grunt of someone at their limit. When one of them passed close to me to climb into the truck bed, I smelled something strange. It wasn't the smell of old wood, much less rotting. It was something chemical, sickly sweet, mixed with a strong smell of wet earth, of basement. That's when I noticed a detail. The wood was visibly old, but the cracks and bottom corners were filled with dark, damp earth. Fresh earth, as if they had just dug that stuff up. After they closed the truck bed, the same man returned my keys, along with a brown paper envelope. There's what was agreed on. Check it later. Now just delivery and that's it. And who do I deliver to? I asked, putting the money in my pocket without even looking at it. He pointed with his chin toward the road. Keep going straight on that trail. You'll come to the entrance of Providence Ranch. A gentleman will be waiting for you. You'll know who it is. Unload, don't sign anything, and no talking needed. Understood. I nodded, got in my truck, and got out of there without even looking in the rearview mirror. The dirt road stretched out in front of me, a red cut through the middle of dry forest. You couldn't see a house or a power line. Nothing. Just the midday sun heating the cab and the dust cloud I was raising forming a cloud that followed me. My cell phone, as expected, was completely without signal. It was just me, the rumble of the engine, and that strange cargo in the bed. The crates themselves didn't make any noise, but their presence seemed to weigh on the air. And with the heat increasing, that smell I had noticed at the ranch began to invade the cab. It was a weak but cloying smell, the mixture of chemical sweetness with damp earth. My head started working, trying to find an explanation that made sense. Old tractor parts, artwork from some eccentric artist. I needed a logical answer to calm myself down, but none seemed good enough. I had been driving for almost an hour in tense monotony when I passed a sharp curve at the edge of a small ravine. That's where I saw the first cross. Simple wood stuck in the dirt. Unfortunately, it's something you get used to seeing on highways, but this one looked new. The wood was still light, the name painted by hand with thick black ink. You could read it perfectly. Albert 2001. It seemed sad, of course, but I kept going. The problem was that about 50 yards ahead there was another one, exactly the same, in the same position. Benjamin 2002. At that moment I felt the sweat on my forehead go cold. That wasn't right. They were too similar, too aligned. I slowed down, almost stopping, with my eyes fixed on the side of the road. There was no doubt, a little further ahead, the third cross. Same shape, same ink, Carlos 2003. Albert Benjamin Carlos, one per year in sequence. I stopped the truck on the shoulder. The engine kept vibrating, but other than that, the silence was absolute. I looked at those 3 crosses. One of them had the remains of a plastic flower, faded by the sun, tied with wire. That wasn't a tribute to accident victims. It was a marker, a warning. I felt the hair on my arms stand up even in the stifling heat. I got back in the cab as fast as I could, locked the door, and floored it. The rest of the trip was hell. Any creak from the suspension, any stone that hit under the chassis made me jump. On a steeper climb where I had to shift into first gear, the cargo in the bed settled with a dull, heavy thud. And at that moment, I swear by all that's holy, I felt something roll back there. Not like a crate tipping over, but like a heavy body turning on its own axis. My first reaction was to want to stop, open the bed, check the tie-downs. But the image of the 3 crosses came to mind, and the memory of the man's voice. Don't come back here. I wasn't going to open that truck bed for anything in this world. I took advantage of a harder stop and looked in the small rearview mirror that gave me a minimal view of the bed through the rear window of the cab. A sliver of sunlight was coming through the poorly closed tarp and illuminating a piece of the first crate. That's when I saw the mark. It wasn't a scratch. It was a symbol burned into the dark wood, deep like the ones used to brand cattle. It wasn't a letter or a drawing. It was a twisted, aggressive shape, something that felt wrong just looking at it. And the wood around it seemed to have darkened with heat, as if the mark had contaminated the area around it. I kept driving with my body tense, feeling every jolt of the truck differently. Fear had become a knot in the pit of my stomach. I just wanted that road to end. And after what seemed like a lifetime, it ended. I came face to face with a more robust wooden gate, and on a plaque worn by time was carved, Providence Ranch. Standing next to it, as if he had emerged from nowhere, was a man. He was a gentleman appearing to be about 70 years old, but with a firm posture. He wore a light dress shirt, dress pants, and a simple hat. In one hand, he held a dark wooden cane that he used more as a symbol of authority than out of necessity. When I got out of the cab, the relief of having finally arrived mixed with a new fear. His gaze was calm in a way that disturbed me. "You must be Sergio," he spoke with a hoarse voice that didn't waver. "That's me, yes. Here's the shipment." He looked over the truck bed, and then at the uneven dirt ground outside the property. "You can unload and leave it right there." The request was so strange that I took time to process it. The ground was a mess, full of bumps and roots. Leaving those heavy crates, there was a guarantee they would tip over and maybe even break. "But sir," I hesitated, realizing I didn't even know his name. "Ferez," he completed with a neutral expression. "You can call me Mr. Ferez. Any problem?" "It's just that the ground here is very uneven, Mr. Ferez. If I just leave them there, the cargo might tip over. It's very heavy." He stared at me for an instant, and you couldn't tell what he was thinking. There was no anger or hurry. It was an ancient coldness. "Don't worry about that. The contents won't complain. Just leave the crates there on the ground." The phrase, "the contents won't complain," hit me full force. Without having anything more to say, I opened the tarp and started the work. I unloaded the first crate using all the strength I had, feeling a pull in my back. Then the second, and finally the third, the one with the brand mark. When I set it on the ground, it tilted to one side, and I heard again, very clearly, the muffled sound of dead weight shifting inside. Mr. Ferez watched everything, motionless, leaning on his cane. When I closed the truck bed, sweating and with my heart beating hard, I turned to leave. His voice, however, made me stop. The trip was quiet, Sergio. The question seemed harmless, but it caught me off guard. Yes, sir. The road's bad, but you get used to it. He took a step in my direction, and for a second I smelled that same smell of earth and chemicals that came from the crates. I'm glad to hear it, he said, his eyes fixed on mine. So you didn't hear anything different on the road? A knock perhaps, or some kind of lament? I simply froze. The image of the 3 crosses, the weight rolling on the curve, everything flashed through my head in an instant. And I lied. I lied out of pure fear. No, sir, nothing at all. Just the noise of the engine. Mr. Ferraz then smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a gesture of the lips, cold and empty. Excellent, he said in a low voice. Good thing you didn't hear anything. It's a sign that the trip was quiet for them too. I didn't even answer. I just got in the cab, started up, and got out of there, spinning tires in the dirt. Through the rearview mirror, the last image I had was of Mr. Ferraz, a dark silhouette standing next to the 3 crates against the sun that was already starting to set on the horizon. I drove aimlessly for a while, my foot buried in the accelerator. Fear had become my fuel. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that ranch. When I passed again through the stretch where the 3 crosses were, I did what anyone with an ounce of sense would do. I prayed quietly and asked for protection. And it was at that exact moment that the truck's radio, which had been off the whole time, emitted a loud, sudden screech. A sound of pure static tore through the silence. But for a second, just 1 second, it wasn't just noise. Under the racket, there seemed to be a voice. A long, drawn-out, distorted lament that got lost in the screech as quickly as it came. The radio went silent again. I got home late at night. My wife noticed my paleness, asked if I was okay. I lied, said it was just road fatigue, a tough day. I took a long shower, trying to wash off not just the red dust, but the dirty feeling from that day. It didn't work. That dawn, sleep didn't come. I sat in the kitchen chair in the dark, and the whole story assembled itself in my head. The pieces fit together in a horrible way. The urgency in Vincent's voice, the men at the ranch who wouldn't let me near my own truck, the absurd weight of the crates, the damp earth stuck in the wood cracks, the smell, the 3 crosses with names in year sequence. Albert 2001, Benjamin 2002, Carlos 2003. And Mr. Ferraz's final phrase, it's a sign that the trip was quiet for them too, them. He didn't say for the cargo, he said for them. I didn't just haul crates that day. I hauled bodies, or worse, something that was once people but was now something else. Something that needed symbols branded with fire to keep it quiet. Something they buried, and for some reason I don't want to imagine, needed to transport from time to time. And those crosses on the road weren't a warning. They were a record. I accepted that job for money, to get out of debt. But the price I pay to this day is much higher. Years have passed, but sometimes when I'm alone on a dark highway, I turn off the music, and in the absolute silence of the cab, I could almost swear I hear a weight dragging slowly in the empty bed behind me. It's just my head, I tell myself. But the fear that stayed with me from that day, that's real. It always rides as my passenger. I never thought moving into a small apartment in Portland would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. It started innocently enough. I was thrilled to find affordable housing near my new tech job. The rent was reasonable, the location was perfect, and I thought life would finally be simple and peaceful. But I was wrong. My roommate Marcus turned out to be someone I'll never forget. From the moment I met him, something felt off. He was tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to look right through me, as if seeing things I couldn't see. At first, I convinced myself he was just shy or preferred solitude. He spent almost all his time in his room, which was always locked. He rarely came out, and when he did, he barely spoke a word. For a while, I tried to believe we simply had different habits, and that living together would become more pleasant over time. But it didn't. At night, I sometimes heard Marcus whispering. The sounds were initially quiet, as if he was on the phone, but as the nights progressed, the whispers became louder and more urgent, as if he was deeply engaged in conversation with someone or something that wasn't in the room. I told myself not to worry. Maybe he was just watching horror movies or rehearsing lines for a theater production. I tried to ignore the growing unease in my stomach. Then, strange odors began emanating from Marcus's room. At first, it was just an unpleasant, faint smell. But soon it became so strong I could no longer pretend it was normal. It reminded me of something rotting, like spoiled meat or garbage that had been left outside too long. When I confronted Marcus about it, he laughed in a strange, hollow way. He said he had spilled something and would clean it up soon, but the stench never disappeared. On the contrary, it got worse. I also noticed how Marcus seemed to glide through the apartment, moving almost silently. He was so quiet that sometimes I didn't notice. He was standing right behind me. Late at night, when I got up for water, I would see him standing in the hallway. His eyes followed me, dark and cold, and it felt like he was watching my every movement. I hurried back to my room each time. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to find out what Marcus was doing. As quietly as possible, I went to his door. It was slightly ajar, and a narrow strip of light fell into the dark hallway. My heart was pounding, but I pushed the door open a bit further. Inside, I saw Marcus standing in the center of the room, surrounded by burning candles. Their flickering flames cast enormous shadows on the walls. Marcus held an old, yellowed book in his hands and spoke in a deep, foreign voice. I couldn't understand a single word. It sounded like a foreign language, or maybe no language at all. The air was heavy, as if something dark and dangerous was hovering in the room. Suddenly, I noticed a figure in the corner. It was hunched and distorted, with eyes that glowed in the candlelight. The sight made my heart skip a beat. I stumbled back in fear, and without thinking, I ran to my room, slammed the door shut, and hid trembling under my blanket, praying that morning would come soon and bring me a sense of safety. When morning came, I hoped the daylight would make everything better, but the opposite was true. It got worse. Marcus became increasingly unpredictable. His whispering became louder and more frequent. He seemed to barely eat or sleep anymore. He often stared at me for minutes at a time, as if studying me. One evening, I mustered the courage to ask him what was wrong, but he just stared through me and said nothing. Then one night, Marcus suddenly vanished. His room was empty, the candles were blown out, the strange book was gone. I searched every corner of our small apartment, but he was nowhere to be found. I should have been relieved, but a feeling of oppression remained. It felt like he was still there, like he was watching me from a place I couldn't see. Days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of life from Marcus. I tried to return to my normal routine, working, cooking, sleeping. But every time I entered the apartment, a feeling of oppression settled over me like a dark cloud. I flinched at every small sound and constantly looked over my shoulder, expecting to see Marcus standing there. Then the scratching began. One late evening, I heard a soft scraping in the walls. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a mouse or rat. But the sound became louder and more insistent until it was impossible to ignore. It sounded like something with sharp claws was trying to scratch through the wall. Soon after they appeared, the creatures. They crawled out of dark corners, their bodies distorted and unnaturally shaped. Their eyes glowed intensely and frighteningly. I stood frozen, my heart pounding as they scurried across the floor. There were so many, and they all seemed to be looking directly at me. It felt like they were waiting for a command. I was like an animal trapped in a cage. In that moment, I realized I had to flee. I grabbed my keys and ran toward the door, but then I saw him. Marcus stood in the doorframe, blocking my way. His face was even paler than before, his eyes emptier than ever. "You can't leave," he said like a judge pronouncing a verdict. "You belong to us now." Panic seized me, and somehow I found the courage to push past him. I ran down the hallway and out of the building without looking back even once. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe until I was far, far away. That night changed everything for me. I never returned to that apartment, never saw Marcus again. Sometimes I wonder if what I experienced was real or just a nightmare brought on by stress and isolation. But the memory of those glowing eyes, that suffocating darkness, and Marcus's final words still haunt me. I moved across the country after that, started fresh in a new city. But even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself looking over my shoulder, especially in the dark. The feeling that something is watching me never completely goes away. Whatever Marcus was involved in, whatever those creatures were, I know I barely escaped something far worse than I could have imagined. For 2 years, I lived with my college roommate Jake in a small house near the University of Colorado campus. Even though we had shared a dorm room for a year during our studies, we were never particularly close friends. We simply had similar plans for after graduation, so it made sense to move in together back then. The first year went really well. We grew closer and enjoyed living together so much that we extended our lease for another year. What happened here occurred in July, 2 months after we had renewed our rental agreement. After a normal late shift at the restaurant where I worked, I came home and chatted with Jake for a while. Then we both decided to go to bed. But in the middle of the night, I woke up because the floorboards in the hallway were creaking. I heard footsteps slowly moving toward the living area. I turned over and looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. I thought Jake was just getting a glass of water or something. I didn't really care at that moment, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I had to leave early for work, so I was somewhat stressed. But Jake opened his door, looked tired, and asked me a question I wasn't expecting. He asked me what I had been doing walking around the house in the middle of the night. I was immediately puzzled. I told him it wasn't me, but that I had thought I heard him walking around. That ended our conversation because I had to leave for work. Honestly, I thought our floors or walls had simply creaked from the wind blowing against the house or something, if it really hadn't been Jake. When I returned from work, Jake wasn't there. He was at his job. I spent most of the evening alone in my room, and eventually, around the same time as the night before, I went to bed. But again, I woke up around the same time because the floorboards made that creaking sound again. This time, I didn't fall back asleep immediately, but tried to listen more carefully. It sounded exactly like someone slowly walking through the hallway toward the living room. When the footsteps reached the other side of the house, it became completely quiet for about 30 seconds. Then I decided to get up and check. I opened my door and went to the living room, but Jake wasn't there. As far as I could see, there was nothing that could have explained the sound. I went back to my room and fell asleep again. What I found so strange about it was that the sound moved through the house. If it had just been the house itself creaking, why would the sound move so slowly from one end to the other? The next morning, I told Jake about it, but neither of us had an idea what it could have been. Jake had the day off, but I had to be at work at 2 in the afternoon. I didn't get back home until around 11 at night. As I walked down the hallway to my room, I was surprised to see Jake still awake. I saw him out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting on his bed in his room. As I walked past his open door, I called out, "Hey, everything good?" while continuing to my room, but Jake didn't answer. I found that strange, but thought maybe he hadn't heard me. So I went into my room, changed out of my work clothes, and put on normal clothes. Then I left my room to go to the kitchen and make something to eat, and I noticed that the light in Jake's room was now off. As I passed his room, I glanced in just to see if everything was okay. He was still sitting on his bed in the corner, but now in the darkness where I could barely see him. "Hey, everything okay, Jake?" I asked, but after he said nothing for a few seconds, I just continued to the kitchen. That was definitely weird, but I didn't know what else to do. Obviously, I wouldn't just march into his room for no reason just to make him answer me. But it was very strange that he hadn't even said a quick hello or reacted at all. I was maybe 15 minutes in the kitchen, then went back to my room. When I passed Jake's door, it was closed. I stayed in my room for about an hour until I heard it again, the creaking of the floorboards directly in the hallway. I looked at the door and suddenly saw something moving underneath it. I heard the creaking continue, but after the last interactions with Jake had been so weird, I decided to simply text him this time and ask if that was him walking around. I waited a few minutes, then finally got a response, a question mark, followed by "What do you mean?" "I'm not even home right now." I went pale and my eyes immediately wandered to the door. I stood up and hurried into the hallway. No one was there, but Jake's bedroom door was now open again. I stood quietly and listened, but heard nothing. I went closer and looked carefully through the door. In the middle of the pitch-black room stood an unknown man. Even in the darkness, now that he was closer and facing me, I could see that he was taller and had a thick beard, 2 distinct features that Jake didn't have, and that I hadn't been able to recognize before. Without hesitating further, I ran out of the house. I immediately called the police from across the street. When they arrived, the man, whoever he was, had disappeared. Strangely, there were no signs of how he had gotten into the house or how he had left it, except for a window that was slightly open. But it didn't look like it had been used recently. What's really disturbing is the thought that he was probably the reason for the creaking floorboards the previous nights. That means he had been walking around the house in the middle of the night while we were sleeping. Even creepier is the question of why he was simply sitting on Jake's bed in his room, apparently waiting for something. Interestingly, that was the only day in recent days when Jake had been free, and I had to work, which meant Jake would have been home alone all evening. That makes me suspect that the unknown man somehow knew this and had been waiting for Jake to surprise him when he was alone. That would explain why the man was waiting in Jake's room and why he didn't do anything to me. Fortunately, Jake happened to be at a friend's place that evening. Whatever the real reason was, we'll probably never find out, and if we do, it might be when it's too late. The police questioned several neighbors, but no one had seen anything suspicious. They dusted for fingerprints, but found nothing useful. The window that was slightly open led to our backyard, which was surrounded by a tall wooden fence. There were no footprints in the soft dirt below the window, which made the whole thing even more mysterious. Jake and I both had trouble sleeping for weeks after that. We installed better locks, a security system, and even got a dog, a German Shepherd we named Rex. But the damage was done. The sense of safety we'd felt in our home was completely shattered. We never found out who the man was or what he wanted. The police case went cold after a few weeks. Jake moved out at the end of our lease, and I can't say I blamed him. Sometimes I still wonder if the man ever came back, if he's still out there, waiting and watching other unsuspecting people in their homes. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.